For this enrichment lesson, we are going to be looking at the different properties that can be used on numbers, numerical expressions, or algebraic expressions. So first off, reminder what a variable is. A variable is a letter used to represent an unknown value. Properties that we're going to be talking about are statements that are true for all numbers. So no matter what number is plugged in for like a variable or any different numbers that you're using, it's going to work. What's important to note that they are used for addition and multiplication, but they cannot be applied to subtraction or division. So the opposites. It works for adding and multiplying, does not work for subtracting and dividing. So if you ever are given ones that are asking if what property is and it has subtraction or division, it's not going to work. So first let's look at the commutative property. The commutative property is the order in which numbers are added or multiplied, does not change the answer. So it means when I flip something around, the order does not change. So for example, if we have 3 plus 7, that is the same thing as 7 plus 3. Flipped around, it works. With variables, this is where it's going to be relevant this unit. If I have 4 plus x, that is the same exact thing as saying x plus 4. So when you see me writing things, I'm always going to put the variable first. But if you put the number first, you need to be able to make that realization that they mean the same thing, even though they're in a different order. This also works for multiplication. So 5 times 8 is the same thing as 8 times 5. That order does not matter. Or again, if we have variables, x times 9 is the same thing as 9 times x. Kind of like this other one up here. This is the proper way to write it with the number first, but if you wrote it this way, it means the same thing. So when you flip it around for adding or multiplying, it stays the same. Next up is the associative property, and this one is one that people mix up a lot with the commutative. They kind of flip-flop those ones. So the commutative property, we're generally looking at two numbers flipped around. The associative property, we have parentheses in. That's going to be a key part. So the way in which three numbers are grouped when adding or multiplying does not change the answer. So for example, if I have 9 plus 2 plus 8, that is the same thing if I keep it in the same order, but instead of 9 and 2 being in the parentheses, 2 and 8 are in the parentheses. This is something you might use for like mental math. I might want to add 2 and 8 together first because that makes 10, which is easier to add to. This also works with variables. So if we have x plus 1 plus 6, that's the same thing as x plus 1 plus 6. So we might want to group these numbers together because they can be added and combined. We put the numbers in one group, the variables in another. This works for multiplication as well. So maybe I want to do, we have 6 times 4 times 5. That's the same thing as 6 times 4 times 5. Again, this might be a mental math strategy. 4 times 5 makes 20, which is easier for me to do in my head. Multiplication examples with variables. So if we have y, I'll use a different variable, y times 2 times 10, that's the same thing as y times 2 times 10. Same idea as up here, we want to group those common numbers together. So commutative is just flipping around, associative is changing the grouping symbols, stay in the same order but changing those parentheses. The identity property, when I think of the word identity, that's kind of the important part here. It means I'm keeping my identity. I'm not changing. I'm staying the same. So we got to think about when we're adding, what do we add to numbers so that they don't change value, they stay the same? Or what do we multiply to something that's not going to change the value? So for addition, the only number that we can add to another number without changing the value is 0. 7 plus 0 keeps its identity, it stays 7. This is important with variables. Let's say I have the variable b. That is the same thing. B plus 0 means b. You can simplify, you don't need the plus 0 in there. With multiplication, 4 times 1, not 4 times 0, 4 times 1 keeps its identity of 4. With variables, the same thing to understand is 1 times x is the same thing as saying x. So if you have x, we can rewrite it as 1x, or if you have 1x, you can rewrite it as x. They mean the same thing. And then the last property, this one sometimes people get mixed up with the additive identity. It's the 0 property, which is going to have the most zeros in it, right? So the product of any number and 0 is 0. So what's important is we are multiplying by 0. So 12 times 0 is 0. Or with variables, x times 0 is 0. So a lot of people mix it up with the additive property, but we have to remember the result is not 0 for the additive identity. So now looking at some practice problems of identifying what property, if it's true statement, and if so, what property, if false, why not. So looking at this, we've changed what the parentheses is grouped around. That is a property. That is the associative property. So that is a true statement, and the property is the associative property. You could also prove it and say, okay, we have 71 plus 2 is 73, 9 plus 73 over here equals 82, or here 9 plus 71 is 80, plus 2 is 82. That works, it's true. All right, here we have 4 plus x equals x plus 4. We just flipped it around. That is the commutative property. Just flipping the order is the commutative property. So that is a true statement, commutative. All right, this one, as soon as I see subtraction, I know immediately this is false because, as we said in the beginning, you cannot apply the properties to subtraction. So when you're explaining why not, one just generic explanation could be the properties don't work with subtraction. If you wanted to do it with numbers and you know how to work with the numbers here, 7 minus 5 is 2. If you plugged in 5 minus 7 in your calculator, you would get -2. And those do not equal each other. So you could say 2 is not equal to -2. Let's do 2 more examples here. Let's say we have 0 times 8 equals 0. This right here, anything multiplied by 0 is the 0 property. So that is true. It is the 0 property. And then last one, let's say we've got 3 divided by, in parentheses, 4 divided by 2 equals 3 divided by 4 in parentheses divided by 2. So technically with those parentheses it would be the associative property, but as soon as we see the division, it is not. It is false. Why? The properties don't work with division. And that's it.